The deadliest soldiers in World War II didn't charge beaches or pilot bombers. They worked alone, in the cold, in the rubble, in the silence between gunshots. And in that silence, they changed the outcome of battles that textbooks barely mention. 500 confirmed kills without a telescopic scope. 309 kills as a woman in a war where women weren't supposed to fight at all. Tactical innovations invented in the ruins of a burning city that are still taught in military academies today. These weren't legends invented after the fact. They were real, and what they accomplished on the battlefield defies almost every assumption we have about the limits of a single human being. Stay with this. Because by the end of this video, you won't just know their names, you'll understand what it actually took to become the most feared figure on the most brutal battlefields of the 20th century. Simo Häyhä, the White Death. The Finnish winter of 1939 was one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. The Soviet Union, with one of the largest armies on Earth, had just invaded Finland, a country with a fraction of the population, a fraction of the equipment, and no realistic chance of holding the line. What followed was supposed to be a quick, decisive Soviet victory. Instead, the Red Army bled for months in the snow. And a significant part of the reason why was a 34-year-old Finnish farmer named Simo Häyhä who had spent his entire life learning how to disappear into a landscape exactly like this one. Häyhä didn't use a telescopic scope. That detail sounds minor until you understand what it means in practice. A scope forces a sniper to raise their head, expose their profile, and create a silhouette that a trained enemy observer can spot. Häyhä kept his head down, his profile flat, his body pressed into the snow for hours without moving. He packed snow into his mouth so his breath wouldn't create visible vapor in the frozen air. He chose firing positions not for comfort or convenience, but for invisibility, sometimes spending an entire day motionless in a white suit against a white landscape, waiting for a single shot. When that shot came, he was already gone before the sound finished echoing through the trees. The Soviets called him the White Death. They didn't use that name as a compliment, they used it because they couldn't find him. They sent counter-snipers. He killed them. They sent entire units to sweep the areas where he'd last been seen. He wasn't there. They called in artillery strikes on his suspected positions. The snow settled. He reappeared somewhere else. In fewer than 100 days of active combat, Häyhä accumulated over 500 confirmed kills, a number so extreme that military historians still debate the methodology used to verify it, not because they doubt his ability, but because the figure is almost incompatible with the time frame. On March 6, 1940, a Soviet soldier managed what an entire army had failed to do. He hit Häyhä with an explosive bullet that tore through his jaw and left him unconscious in the snow. His fellow soldiers carried him out expecting him to die. He didn't. He regained consciousness on March 13, the same day Finland signed the peace treaty that ended the Winter War. He had missed the end of the war by hours. He lived until 2002, reaching the age of 96, and when journalists asked him late in his life what he thought about his kill count, he answered with the same simplicity that defined everything he did on the battlefield. He said he did what he was told, as well as he could. That answer is either the most modest thing a soldier has ever said, or the most chilling. Because behind that simplicity was a man who had engineered his own invisibility with nothing more than discipline, patience, and an almost obsessive knowledge of his environment. The White Death wasn't a myth built after the war. He was a farmer from a small Finnish town who understood one thing better than almost anyone in military history: the most dangerous soldier on a battlefield is the one nobody can see. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death. Here's a question most people never think to ask about World War II. What does it take for a woman to be taken seriously on a battlefield where no one believes she belongs? Not respected, taken seriously. Because when Lyudmila Pavlichenko volunteered for the Red Army in 1941, the recruitment officer suggested she become a nurse instead. She was 24 years old, a history student at Kyiv University, and already an accomplished competitive shooter. She didn't become a nurse. She picked up a rifle, walked onto the front lines of one of the most savage conflicts in human history, and started doing something the recruitment officer clearly hadn't anticipated. She started winning. Pavlichenko fought in the defense of Odessa and later in the brutal siege of Sevastopol, two of the most punishing urban campaigns on the Eastern Front. She operated in conditions where Soviet casualties were measured not in thousands but in hundreds of thousands, where entire divisions were ground down in weeks, where survival itself was an achievement most soldiers didn't manage. In that environment, she accumulated 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers, a category of target that demands a specific and terrifying skill set, because hunting a sniper means becoming the prey at the same time you're the predator. By the time she was pulled from combat in 1942, after being wounded by mortar shrapnel, she had become the most successful female sniper in recorded military history. That record has never been broken. If this story is hitting different from anything you've heard before, if you're realizing there's a version of World War II history that most people never get to see, consider subscribing. There's a lot more like this coming, and you won't want to miss it. What happened next is the part of Pavlichenko's story that most documentaries skip over. The Soviet government, recognizing her propaganda value, sent her to North America on a diplomatic tour, one of the first Soviet citizens ever to be received at the White House, where she met Franklin D. Roosevelt. Her mission was to pressure the Allied powers into opening a second front in Europe to relieve the catastrophic pressure on the Eastern Front. She gave speeches in packed auditoriums across the United States and Canada. And almost immediately, she ran into something she hadn't faced on the battlefield: the Western press. Journalists asked her about her uniform, about her appearance, about whether she used makeup in combat. One reporter suggested her uniform skirt was too long. She stood at the podium and responded with the kind of precision she'd developed behind a rifle scope. She told the audience that she had already killed 309 fascists, and she found it strange that correspondents were interested in her skirt length rather than the war she'd been fighting in. The crowd erupted. That moment traveled. Folk singer Woody Guthrie wrote a song about her. The American public, for a brief period, actually knew her name. But what Pavlichenko understood, and what made her more than just a remarkable soldier, was that the battlefield she was now standing on was different from the ruins of Sevastopol, and it required a different kind of discipline. She delivered her message without flinching, without softening it, and without letting anyone reduce her story to anything smaller than what it actually was. She had come to talk about a war that was killing Soviet soldiers at a rate the Western public could barely comprehend. And she made sure they understood that, even if they'd rather have talked about her skirt. Vasily Zaitsev, the hero of Stalingrad. Picture Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942. Not the city it had been, that was gone. What remained was a landscape of collapsed buildings, exposed steel frameworks, mountains of rubble that had once been apartment blocks and factories and train stations. The Germans controlled roughly 80% of the city. Soviet forces had been pushed to a narrow strip along the western bank of the Volga River, with their backs literally against the water. Reinforcements and supplies came across the river at night, under fire. There was nowhere to retreat. In that environment, claustrophobic, lethal, and measured in city blocks rather than miles, a young Soviet soldier from the Ural Mountains named Vasily Zaitsev began doing something that would outlast the battle itself. Zaitsev had grown up hunting in the mountains, learning patience and precision from his grandfather before he was 10 years old. That background translated to the ruins of Stalingrad with an almost eerie naturalness. He understood instinctively what most soldiers had to be taught, that in urban warfare, The sniper who controls the sight lines controls the psychology of an entire sector. He didn't just shoot. He studied. He memorized the patterns of light and shadow that moved through the rubble at different times of day. He identified which positions offered the best angles on German-held buildings and which ones were traps. He turned the destruction around him into a system, using collapsed walls as hides, moving between positions through tunnels and crawl spaces, never firing from the same location twice in a single day. His kill count at Stalingrad reached over 225 confirmed kills during the battle alone. But the number, significant as it is, isn't what made Zaitsev historically important. What made him important was what he did with his knowledge. The Soviet command recognized that what he had developed wasn't just personal skill, it was transferable method. They pulled him back from the front line periodically to train other snipers, passing on everything he'd learned about urban positioning, target prioritization, and the psychological dimension of sniper warfare. He taught his students that the goal wasn't just to kill, it was to make the enemy afraid to move, afraid to show themselves, afraid to occupy space. A single well-placed sniper, he argued, could effectively neutralize an entire German unit's ability to operate freely in a sector. He was right. The Soviet sniper program that expanded through Stalingrad and beyond owed a significant part of its doctrine to what Zaitsev had worked out in the rubble. There's a famous story, partially mythologized, partially documented, about a duel between Zaitsev and a German master sniper sent specifically to eliminate him. The identity of the German has never been conclusively confirmed, and historians debate the details. But what the story captures, regardless of its precise accuracy, is something real about what Stalingrad had become by late 1942, a city where two armies were fighting not just for territory, but for psychological dominance, one sniper position at a time. Zaitsev understood that dimension of the battle better than almost anyone on either side. He survived Stalingrad, survived the war, and lived until 1991, long enough to see the Soviet Union he had fought for begin to dissolve. He was buried, at his request, in Volgograd, the city that Stalingrad eventually became. The tactics he developed in those ruins, the principles of urban sniper positioning, the use of decoys, the coordination between sniper teams, are still part of military training doctrine in multiple countries. Not as historical curiosities, as working methods. What Zaitsev built in the most destroyed city on the Eastern Front turned out to be one of the most durable contributions any individual soldier made to modern warfare. Matthias Hetzenauer, the silent phantom of the Eastern Front. There's a detail about Matthias Hetzenauer that tends to get overlooked when people discuss the great snipers of World War II, and it's the detail that makes everything else about him make sense. He was 19 years old when he began his combat service on the Eastern Front. Not a seasoned soldier with years of experience behind him. A teenager from the Austrian Alps who had grown up hunting in mountain terrain and who, by the time the war ended, had accumulated 345 confirmed kills, making him the highest confirmed kill sniper in the German armed forces and one of the most lethal individual soldiers of the entire conflict. The youth is important not because it makes the number more impressive, though it does. It's important because it tells you something about what Hetzenauer was before the war turned him into what the records show he became. He operated primarily on the Eastern Front in Romania and Hungary during the final years of the war, a period when the German military was in full strategic retreat, when the logistical infrastructure that had supported the Wehrmacht in its earlier campaigns was collapsing, and when individual soldiers were increasingly fighting not for victory but for survival. In that context, Hetzenauer's effectiveness becomes even harder to explain by conventional standards. He was working with deteriorating supply lines, in units that were constantly being repositioned under pressure, against a Soviet military that had by 1944 developed significant counter-sniper capability of its own. And yet his numbers kept climbing. His method was built on two principles that he applied with almost obsessive consistency: concealment and distance. He was known for taking shots at ranges that pushed the mechanical limits of his equipment, engagements at distances where most trained snipers of the era wouldn't have attempted a shot, relying on an understanding of ballistics and environmental conditions that he had developed through practice rather than formal advanced training. His approach to camouflage went beyond standard military doctrine. He didn't just wear a ghillie suit or use available cover, he engineered his concealment specifically for each position, adapting to the local vegetation, the light conditions, and the likely sight lines of any Soviet observers in the area. Former soldiers who served alongside him described a man who could spend an entire day in a position without revealing himself, even when enemy forces passed within relatively close range. The patience required for that kind of operational discipline is difficult to overstate. It's one thing to be still for an hour. It's another to maintain complete physical and psychological control over an entire day in a combat zone, in terrain that was actively contested, knowing that a single visible movement could end everything. What separates Hetzenauer from some of the other figures in this video is the absence of a larger narrative around him. Haiha became the White Death, a legend built around an impossible number achieved in an impossible situation. Pavlichenko became a global figure, her story inseparable from questions of gender, politics, and propaganda. Zaitsev became a symbol of Soviet resistance, his methods institutionalized into doctrine. Hetzenauer remained, in a sense, just a soldier, extraordinarily effective, almost invisible in the historical record outside of military circles, operating on the losing side of a war defined by atrocities his government had committed. His story doesn't come with the clean moral framing that makes historical figures easy to celebrate. It comes with the uncomfortable complexity that serious history almost always carries, the recognition that extraordinary skill and devastating effectiveness exist independently of the justice of the cause they serve. He was captured by Soviet forces at the end of the war, spent several years as a prisoner, and returned to Austria in the early 1950s. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experience. There are no famous quotes, no dramatic post-war statements, no moment equivalent to Haiha's quiet remark about doing what he was told as well as he could. What remains is the record, and the record, stripped of everything else, forces a specific kind of reflection. These four individuals, a Finnish farmer, a Soviet history student, a shepherd's grandson from the Urals, and a teenage hunter from the Austrian Alps, each found themselves at the center of the most destructive war in human history. Each developed a form of precision that the battlefield around them made possible and necessary, and each left behind something that outlasted the conflict itself. Not just numbers. Methods, stories, questions, and a reminder that the history of warfare is never just about armies. Sometimes it comes down to one person, one position, and one shot that nobody saw coming. If you want to keep exploring World War II, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. We cover the greatest tank battles of the Second World War, the full story, the full scale. It's already there waiting for you.